All right. Thank you all so much. Well, good morning. How you doing today? It's good to see you. We are going to have a great morning today. Today, we start talking about Easter. Isn't that exciting? Now, Easter is an important time of the year, not just to our families, as many of us hold Easter as a key family time in our family rhythm, not just in our churches, as obviously it's one of the major times that we celebrate, kind of that and Christmas is the key holidays in our church calendar, but it's also a time when the world around us is more inclined to think about church. So that family member who doesn't really consider spiritual things for most of the year is more apt to think about spiritual things at this point in the year. That neighbor who hasn't attended church in years, doesn't even think about it, they are more receptive to an invitation to church at this time of the year. So I want to make sure we're wise with that, because it's a great opportunity we have over the next few weeks leading up to April the 1st, when we'll celebrate Easter, to look at people who we know need to connect or reconnect with God, and to recognize that this may be the best opportunity or the most open they'll be all year long, and extend that invitation for them to join us on Easter Sunday. If they can't on Easter Sunday, have them come and be with us next week. But look at someone in your life, whether it's a family member, a neighbor, someone at work, who you know would benefit from reconnecting with God, and we could be a place to help them experience that, and talk to them about it. Simply say, hey, why don't you come to church with me this coming Sunday or next Sunday? It's hard to tell what they might just say yes. All right, so think on that the next few weeks. This morning, as we start thinking about Easter at church, over the next few weeks, we are going to look at 3 different characters that I believe are told around the Easter story. 3 different people, and we're going to kind of try to see what happened through their eyes and then take some cues from their example. Now today, we start with kind of the black eye of the Easter story. We start with Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Christ. Because one thing I believe in, and I don't even like to say it, is that the same heart that was in Judas, the same frustration he experienced, well, that can creep into our hearts as well. And we want to make sure that we keep that at bay, so that what happened in Judas's life doesn't happen in ours. Right? That the heart that drove Judas to make a horrible decision doesn't take root in our lives. So we'll learn a little bit about him, and then we're going to look at 3 areas that we can do better than he did and learn from his example to make sure that we have the right perspective on Christ's life. Now, we have all been to something that was great and left a little disappointed or left a little bummed out. All right, 2 Wednesday nights ago, my family and I were given tickets. We had 4 tickets to go down to the Sprint Center and see the University of Oklahoma play Oklahoma State University in the Big 12 Conference Tournament. Now, this was an exciting deal for us. Being in 7 hours, we don't get to go see them play live. So we were thrilled, and we got down early, and we got to walk around and see all the tournament set up, and we were right outside where the University of Oklahoma came in and out, so Eli and Manny got to go, and they could dangle their hands over, and as they came out the locker room, they got to high-five all the players, and we just had a ball, but Oklahoma got whipped. I mean, it was close for a little while, and we kept having that optimism try to creep up, but we left bummed out. It was great. I mean, the food was good. It was a fun atmosphere, but we were still a little disappointed. Judas Iscariot got to follow Christ personally. Practically live with them. But still was disappointed by the ministry that Christ had. In fact, that's a foundational truth we'll start with today, is that after closely following Jesus for 3 years, Judas found serving him undesirable. It's in your notes. It's something we got to remember as we look at his life, that after Judas got to spend 3 years hearing Jesus teach face to face, watching Jesus do miracles right before his eyes, learning about what was to come and getting kind of cues at what Jesus planned to do through the disciples. After living that way and experiencing all that for 3 years, he still found serving Jesus to be undesirable. And that's a flaw that we don't want to repeat in our lives or in our hearts either. So let's talk just a little bit about who Judas was. Now, the reality is that the Bible really doesn't talk much about him. He was a key player, but outside of his betrayal of Jesus, he's rarely referenced. And when he is, it's in a negative light. In fact, when you read his name, it's almost always followed by the qualifier, the one who betrayed him. Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. And you know what? I understand the perspective of the author of the Gospels. Because if I was going to write a biography of someone that I dearly loved, and there was another individual who created this, or who had this horrible action against him, I wouldn't talk much about that person either. So it makes sense that we don't read a lot about them when we think about it from Matthew and Mark and Luke, John's perspective, but we still need to learn a bit about him. So we have to look kind of outside at other historical writings. One thing we would see is that Judas's name means Jehovah leads. It's Judas is a derivative of Judah, which means Jehovah leads, meaning that his parents had a high hope for how Judas would do spiritually. So he was likely brought up in an environment that should have prepared him for following Christ and what was to come. Name meant Jehovah leads, or God leads. Strong name for a disciple. He did come into the group of disciples as kind of an outsider. Not necessarily an outcast, just an outsider. Judas was from Judea. Most of the other disciples were from Galilee. Many of the other disciples came with a brother or a friend, because as one individual met Christ, they went and got a loved one or someone they cared about and said, hey, you got to come experience this as well. Judas didn't come in with any other relationships. Kind of an outsider. Now, I don't know that set him up to fail in the way he did. It's just a reality that he didn't have any built-in relationships like some of the other disciples would have had. He, however, did arise to a level of trust because he was given the role of being a treasurer, the treasurer for the group. Now, yes, he would abuse that in time, but at one point or another, he was viewed as highly trustworthy by Jesus and probably the other disciples. Meaning, I think he was good with money. That he was the guy that when you looked in his checkbook, it balanced. When he opened up his wallet, the bills were all lined up. He didn't just, pull in his pocket and grab 5 or 6 wadded up bills to pay for lunch at the restaurant or whatever. He was good with money. He was organized, and he had shown some signs of character because you wouldn't assign the treasury role to someone you didn't trust. So he wasn't bad the whole 3 years. It's something that happened in his heart at the end that created such a fatal flaw. We also know that there was a time where Judas remained very committed to following Christ when many others didn't. If you were to look back in John 6, chapter 6, verses 66 through 71, in that passage, Jesus is teaching on some very difficult realities, and the realities he's referencing is what is to come in the lives of those who are going to follow him. Because as the early church would show, they were going to live hard lives. That their effort to build God's kingdom and his church were not going to be well received. And we know historically it was a very difficult task that cost many of those early followers of Jesus their lives. And Jesus is teaching that, and it says that many left. Meaning that there had been a crowd of people, maybe up to 1,000 or more people, who were following Christ, latched onto his teaching. They hear about how hard their life is getting ready to be, and they leave. Judas was one that stayed. Again, I believe early in those 3-year period when he followed Christ, I believe he was committed to following him. I believe that for some period of time, his life was in the right place. But as time went on, I believe that Judas's heart grew disillusioned. And that's where we've got to begin to watch our heart as well. This is when we begin to make sure that we see what happened in Judas's life and recognize the warning signs so they don't happen in our life as well. Judas began disillusioned about the way that Christ's ministry was being played out. Judas, I believe, like many of the disciples, was looking for the Messiah. Because the Messiah had been promised. God had said throughout the children of Israel, throughout Jewish history, I'm sending someone to save you. However, when God said, I'm sending someone to save you in a spiritual sense, Judas, and I believe many of the followers, wanted a political leader. They wanted someone to come back and embolden the Jews to whip the Romans who were oppressing the early believers, or the Jewish believers. Because it was a hard time when you were a Jew within the Roman Empire. Because Rome kept a tight thumb on them. And it was rather oppressive. Something that, living in North America today, we just don't have a reference point to. They wanted someone to come free them from Roman oppression. Jesus didn't play out like that. Jesus wasn't a military leader. He didn't come back on a horse with the rally cry of we can go defeat Rome and get the political freedom to worship God like we want to return to. Jesus came back as a spiritual Messiah to save them from their sins, not just to rescue them in a political sense. And I believe as Judas saw that play out, as he recognized more and more Jesus wasn't going to be who he had hoped he would be, it began to change his heart. I think that's where the disappointment set in. See, Judas would have been one of many who wanted a political leader. One of some of the disciples who would have wanted a political leader. But many of the others, their heart adapted to what Jesus was doing and who he was. And Judas's, his heart didn't make that leap. His heart didn't change. So he became disappointed and unfulfilled. And it became undesirable for him to be a part of what God wanted to do when God just wasn't shaping up like Judas had hoped. The problem is that not only did he find serving Christ to be undesirable, he couldn't find anything else that was any more desirable either. He, as we know, as Pastor Brandon read a bit ago, Judas worked with the Jewish leadership to identify who Christ was at a point to where they could arrest him and begin the trials that would lead to the point to where they could convince the Roman government that he was a threat to the peace in the Roman Empire and have him crucified. See, one key thing we got to remember over the next few weeks is Rome didn't really care what the Jews did or believed. They just wanted everything calm and quiet. Kind of like sometimes as a parent, you don't care what your kids do as long as it's quiet and nothing's on fire. Rome didn't have a problem with what the Jews wanted to believe. They just didn't want an uproar. So they just kept their thumb on it, so it was suppressed. So the Jewish leadership had to come up with a reason as to why Jesus was a threat to the peace, but first they had to clearly identify who he was. So Judas was going to be the follower that pointed out to the Sanhedrin the exact person that Jesus was, and he did it for 30 pieces of silver, which is just not worth it. And he would find that in his own life as well. Now, when I connect the dots and I see he was the treasurer, he was good with money, and money was the way that the enemy got him to step away from what Jesus was doing in his life, it reminds me we got to remember where we place our focus. Because where money was once probably a strength of his and he was good at managing it, it became an all-consuming desire. So we got to watch what we focus on and what we value to make sure we don't eventually value some earthly temporal thing more than we value God's activity in our life. Judas would get these 30 pieces of silver. He would go and identify after the Last Supper and right before the trials and crucifixion would begin to take place. He would go identify exactly who Christ was. After he was arrested, Judas was so overwhelmed by guilt, he would go back and try to return the money that he accepted as a bribe. Because he didn't want it anymore. It wasn't worth it anymore. It didn't lead to the fulfillment that he had hoped. They said, we can't take that. That's against our religious law. It's blood money. So they went and bought a field with it. Judas was still so overwhelmed by guilt, eventually he would take his own life. Because when serving Christ was deemed undesirable, so was everything else that he could experience in life. And after 3 years of seeing all of that, he was still left with the heart of disappointment because Jesus' ministry didn't turn out like he had hoped. Like Jesus didn't work in his life and accomplish what he had hoped God would accomplish. And I want to contrast that with a little bit or kind of bring in another reference point. And it really comes from the life of John the Baptist, who himself had some doubts at a difficult time in his life as well. I'm going to read out of Luke chapter 7, verses 18 through 23. Here it's written, the disciples of John reported all these things to him, to Jesus. The disciples of John reported all these things to him. Those are all the activities that Jesus is doing, and they are bringing a report back to John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, as to what is taking place. And so John, calling 2 of his disciples to him, sent them to the Lord, saying, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And when the men had come to him, they said, John the Baptist has sent us to you, saying, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? In that hour he healed many people of diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many who were blind he bestowed sight. And he answered them, go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me. John the Baptist in this moment is struggling with Jesus' ministry. John the Baptist is also in prison, and he's getting ready to lose his life because he did the right thing. Because he, to a high-ranking Roman official, defended the truth of God's word. And it's going to cost him his life, and I think he probably recognized that this is going to end my life. These actions I did trying to honor God are going to cost me my life. And that is creating some natural doubt in his life. And so he sends some of his followers to go to Christ, and I believe he's seeking confirmation. He's wanting to know that Jesus is really who he said he was, and that everything he had invested his life into is still pointing in the right direction. So he sends his followers to ask Jesus, I believe, for a word of confirmation. Are you the one who we've been waiting for? And Jesus performs miracles before them, so they've got a first-hand account of Jesus' power and his divinity, and everything that Jesus was said he could do and would do is being played out in front of their eyes. And he sends a message back to his cousin and said, blessed is the one who's not offended by me. And if we could take that back to the Greek, I believe the closest we could get to what Jesus intended to say in that saying was a word of encouragement to those who heard it, and to John himself, saying, blessed is the one who is not discouraged or upset or offended when my ministry does not turn out the way they had hoped. Blessed is the one who is not offended when I am different, or I act different, or when God works differently in our lives than we had hoped. He says to John, blessed is the one who's not offended by ministry, even when it doesn't pan out the way they had wanted or what they would have designed. And that's where Judas's heart went too far. Because when he was disappointed by Jesus' ministry, it became overwhelming, and he was offended. So much so that he took a tremendously devastating action, not just to Christ, but to himself. Because he couldn't get past the disappointment. And you know, church, all of us at one point or another will be disappointed by God. Now, I don't think that's a good thing, but I think all of us are going to look at what God does or what God does not do in our lives or around us and feel let down a little bit. I know I have. But to keep us from taking it to the extent that Judas did, to keep this disappointment from causing us this spiritual harm, I think there's 3 areas, and we're going to look at them real quick, that we've got to embrace God's work in our life to make sure we accept Him and His work and His ministry and not be disillusioned by God's activity when it's not like we had hoped. The first thing we need to do is to embrace God's forgiveness. God's just plain and simple forgiveness of our sin. Sometimes we just overcomplicate this. We make grace and forgiveness so much more in depth than God intended for it to be. God's forgiveness of sin is rather simple. When we recognize we've fallen below God's perfect standard, we ask for His forgiveness and He gives it. Period. He is the only one who can truly forgive and move past it in ways that our hearts really, truly can't in a lot of instances. God forgives our sin and restores the relationship on our behalf. It's not something we can earn. It's not something that when we realize we've messed up, that we can just do enough to impress Him enough and then He'll forgive us. It's plain and simple. God, I have stepped out of bounds. I've fallen short of your perfect example and your expectations, and I need your forgiveness. And He does it every single time. And that happens in the grand scheme of our sin, when as a 15-year-old, I asked for God to forgive my sin so I could commit my life to Him. He forgave them all. It's not like He said, well, everything you did in the first 15 years of your life is covered, but we'll see what happens from moving forward. No, He forgave all my sins. The ones I committed as a child and a young teenager, and the ones I will commit prior to going to heaven to be with Him. All my sins have been forgiven. And we need to embrace that. It's also true that sometimes we need to embrace God's forgiveness of a particular sin. I have met with a number of believers who look at a decision they made or a mistake they made, and I have heard them say, I know God forgives me, but I can't forgive me for that. And that's backwards, because if an all-perfect, morally pure God can forgive us of that decision or that activity, then we need to just rest in that and recognize that as a sinful human being, if God can forgive us, we ought to be able to forgive ourselves and move past it as well. And not that there's no earthly consequences or we feel like we got to get out of jail free card. Just that we recognize that our sin has been forgiven and God wants to move forward in the relationship with Him. Judas couldn't get past the guilt. Had he, Jesus would have forgiven him with no questions asked. In our lives, we need to embrace God's forgiveness. The second area I want us to look at is we need to embrace God's fulfillment. We need to embrace the fulfilling life and the whole life or the abundant life, the life that has purpose and meaning. We need to embrace God's definition of a fulfilling life. Sometimes as Christians we can become, and you've probably seen what I call an Eeyore Christian. Think back to the Disney character Eeyore, and it's always cloudy in Eeyore's world. the glass is always 2/3 full, empty. It's no sunshine. He's just got a down and out attitude. And sometimes we approach following Christ with a down and out attitude. You know, I'm a Christian, so I can't do that. I've got to do this. My life's got to be that way. That's not the life that God sent his son so we could live. Jesus himself said, the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But I come that you may have life and have it to the fullest, or other translations say to have it to the abundance. God came and God wants to give us a fulfilling life. But we've got to adopt his definition of what fulfillment means and not our own. Right? In a similar way, I'm going to tell a quick story real quick because it kind of shows what I think we do with fulfillment. But there's a popular sitcom right now called This Is Us. It will make you feel things. If you're a crier, it will make you cry. If you are not a crier, it'll make something be in your eye that itches and you've got to rub. All right? And it chronicles the story of 3 twins that live different lives, and it just shows their relationship, and it's a really great show. But one of the twins, one of the boys, fostered a teen girl, and she's getting ready to return home to live with their mom, and he said to her, remember to work hard, which is great advice to anyone in life. And he said, why do you work hard? And she said, because you'll get a big house and a fancy car. And he had taught her that definition of success, because if you work hard, you'll succeed. And to him, success was a big house and a fancy car, because he had done well, and that's what success had brought him. Many of us don't define success that way. Many of us look at other areas of life as indicators that we have succeeded, whether it's healthy relationships, whether it's we're stable enough to enjoy our retirement, whether it's we look back at our career and we made it to a level of leadership that we wanted. Most of us don't have that definition of success, right? In a very similar way, we've got to be careful how we define fulfillment, because we need to adopt God's definition of fulfillment. And if it's not lined up with our definition, we're going to have to pick which one we function off of. See, we will be fulfilled in a relationship with God by relating to him and serving him and accomplishing his plan for our lives. And if we don't adopt that definition of fulfillment, we're going to be left with frustration. If we want to have a fulfilling life and have it our way, then God's work in our life isn't going to pan out like we had hoped. So we've got to embrace his definition of fulfillment, what it means from his eyes for us to have a purposeful and meaningful life. And when we embrace that, we will embrace what he said in John 10:10, that I've come so that you can have a fulfilling life. That's something we all want. Well, to experience that, we've got to make sure we're on his page of what it means to embrace fulfillment. It's a mistake Judas made is he couldn't get his definitions right. The third thing we need to embrace is his kingdom. Once we have accepted God's forgiveness, once we have committed our lives to him, we have been given an active role in building God's kingdom. There are no sideline believers. There's nobody that God looks at and says, hey, I'm so glad that we have a relationship and that you've allowed me to forgive you, but I don't really need you to do anything. It never works like that. All of us have a role in building his kingdom, and we need to be encouraged by that. We need to look at that and be energized by that, and we need to make our role in building God's kingdom to become our purpose in life. And that will look differently. Sometimes you will build God's kingdom through your career. Sometimes you will do it through grandparenting. But we all have a role to play in building God's kingdom, and we need to embrace that. We need to be energized by that. We need for that to be a focal point of how we view our time on earth, is the specific plan that God has for us to accomplish. We look at the life of Judas and wonder, how did it get like that? How could someone follow Jesus all that time and see him firsthand and still walk away and make the decisions he did? Well, it happened because he got his heart out of line. His heart got disillusioned. His heart got disappointed. Like I said, we've got to make sure we don't make that same mistake as well. So we look at these three areas saying, okay, these are three things I can do to make sure my heart never becomes in a condition that will lead me to spiritual harm. We embrace his forgiveness. We embrace his definition of fulfillment. We embrace our role in building his kingdom. We do those three things, we'll find a life following Christ that is better than anything we could have imagined. We embrace those three things, our life will leave a bigger impact on earth than we could have imagined. And we will find that life to be desirable. Where Judas rejected those three things, he found serving Christ to be undesirable. We embrace those three things we just talked about, we will find a life serving Christ to be incredible and better than any other way we could spend our time on earth. But we've got to get those three things right. Judas, he plays a tough role in the Easter story. Right? When there's Easter pageants at church, no one says, hey, I really want to be Judas. But the reality is that his heart could become our heart if we're not careful. So we've got to make sure we keep our heart in line. And we learn from his example, and we look at some practical things in our own life that we can accomplish to keep our heart in line with God's heart. Just a moment, Miss Jackie, Miss Carol come up. They'll begin to lead us as we wind down our service. Over the next few moments, chances are that something we talked about in the life of Judas or one of those more direct talking points that we went through at the last part, probably something struck a chord. I know as I looked through this throughout the week and thought about our time together this morning, that things came to my mind. Well, that's God trying to get your attention. So use these next few moments to talk to God about that. Ask him what you need to do to make sure your heart lines up with his, that you don't end up one day with a heart that finds serving Christ to be undesirable. Let me pray for us, and then Miss Jackie will come up. Lord, thank you so much for today and what you're doing in our lives and the life of our church. I thank you that you made the effort to give us your word so that we can learn what you taught, but also we can learn from the examples of those who served you and experienced you. God, I ask that you would be with us as we continue to think on what we've discussed today over the morning and probably some in the coming week. And God, that if you're aiming to get our attention on something and help us redirect our heart, that we would be attentive to that and we would be responsive to anything you may be saying or doing in our lives. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Would y'all please stand?